Good evening, all, and welcome back to Fear Knocks. Coal country feels different once the day shift clocks out. The back roads go quiet, the creek mist hangs low across the turns, and the old company rows sit with only a few weak bulbs holding on. Metal ticks in cold chutes. Distant machinery settles in long breaths, and every hollow between the ridges carries sound farther than it should. A one-lane timer drifts out of sync while footsteps ring along the grating. A conveyor hums through full shutdown as if someone keyed it from inside. A mine gate pings a dead channel with no unit logged in. And a porch bulb shakes once before 3 knocks travel through an empty company house. Tonight's stories come from patrol notes, scanner polls, county sheets, and long shift logs that rarely leave these valleys. One case in this set was almost taken out of the archive entirely. You'll recognize it when we reach it. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. And keep the bell on. We post a new one every night. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Your comments help the channel grow and keep these investigations alive. All right, let's get into it. I was a volunteer traffic aide, assigned to monitor a single-lane bridge over the Tipples Creek. It was late autumn, the air barely above freezing, and a thin fog often clung to the low-lying areas. That night, the routine timing of the bridge felt subtly, unnervingly off. My station was a small, unheated cabin set back from the gravel approach road. My primary duty involved managing the flow of vehicles across the old steel grate bridge, especially during the night shifts when visibility was poor. The bridge was a critical link for the few remaining residents and occasional mine access vehicles in this remote holler. Traffic was sparse after midnight, sometimes only a few cars an hour, but the protocol required constant vigilance. I kept a stopwatch and a logbook, meticulously recording vehicle crossings and any unusual observations. The creek below usually provided a low, constant hush, a natural white noise against the isolation. The bridge itself was a relic, a narrow span of rusted steel and open grating that hummed under the weight of even a light pickup. It stretched perhaps 100 feet across the dark water, connecting 2 stretches of winding back road. My job was to ensure only one vehicle crossed at a time, using a simple timer system for safety. I would activate a countdown, allowing a vehicle to clear the bridge before signaling the next. Most nights were uneventful. A quiet vigil broken only by the occasional crackle of the radio or the distant rumble of an approaching engine. The cold was a constant companion, seeping through the cabin walls, making the hum of the old fluorescent light feel almost warm by comparison. The first discrepancy occurred around midnight. I had just logged a small sedan heading east. I reset my stopwatch, allowing a standard interval before the next potential crossing. A few minutes later, I heard it. A distinct, metallic ping, then another, echoing from the bridge grating. It was the sound of footsteps, light but clear, moving across the steel. I looked up, scanning the dark road for headlights. There were none. The sound continued, a steady rhythm, moving from the far end of the bridge towards my side. My stopwatch, however, still showed a significant portion of the countdown remaining. I leaned forward, peering through the cabin window into the thick night. The fog had intensified, making it difficult to see more than a few yards beyond the cabin's perimeter. The footsteps persisted, growing louder, closer. I checked my stopwatch again. It still read 1.5 minutes before the bridge would be clear for another crossing. This was impossible. No vehicle had entered the bridge, and no person should have been walking across it in the dark, especially not without a light. The sound was too regular, too deliberate to be an animal. It was clearly the cadence of someone walking. I reached for my heavy-duty flashlight, clicking it on. Its beam cut a stark path through the fog, illuminating the gravel road leading to the bridge. The footsteps were now directly on the bridge, the pinging sound resonating with an unnerving clarity. I could almost feel the vibration through the ground. I swept the beam across the bridge deck, from one end to the other. Nothing. The steel grating was empty. No figure, no shadow, just the dull gleam of wet metal under the powerful light. Yet the sound continued, moving steadily, now just a short distance from my side of the bridge. My breath hitched in the cold air. The sound was so close I felt I should be able to see the person, even through the fog. I could almost pinpoint their location by the sound alone. It was directly in front of me, just beyond the reach of the cabin's porch light. Then, as abruptly as it began, the footsteps ceased. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hum of the forest and the faint rush of the creek below. My stopwatch still showed about 30 seconds remaining on the timer. I stood there, flashlight beam fixed on the empty bridge, my hand hovering over the radio. I waited for a long moment, listening intently. The static on the radio was a low whisper in the background. My eyes strained against the darkness, trying to discern any movement, any shape in the fog. There was nothing. The cold seemed to deepen, a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. I slowly lowered the flashlight, my gaze still fixed on the bridge. The timer on my stopwatch finally beeped, signaling the end of the interval. The bridge was officially clear, but it had been clear for a while, or so the absence of a visible person suggested. I decided to log the incident, noting the time and the nature of the sound. I described it as unidentified auditory event, consistent with footsteps on bridge grating, no visual confirmation. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the fog played tricks with sound. Maybe a large animal, though the rhythm was distinctly human. I reset the timer for the next cycle. About an hour later, the pattern repeated. The footsteps began again, from the far side, moving across the bridge. Again, no headlights, no visible person. This time, I had my flashlight ready, sweeping the bridge as soon as the sound began. Still, nothing. The pinging continued, moving steadily, crossing the entire span, then fading into the gravel on my side. I immediately called dispatch. My voice was calm, measured, as I reported the anomaly. I explained the timer desync, the auditory evidence, and the lack of visual confirmation. The dispatcher, a veteran named Frank, listened patiently. He suggested it might be an echo, or perhaps a local resident taking a shortcut on foot, though he agreed it was unusual for someone to be out there without a light. He said he would send a patrol car to check the area, but it would take some time to reach my remote location. I thanked him, the receiver feeling cold in my hand. I stepped out of the cabin, pulling my heavy coat tighter. The air was damp and bitingly cold. I walked slowly towards the bridge approach, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. I moved cautiously, checking the gravel for any fresh tracks. The ground was damp, but the recent light frost had made it hard to distinguish anything new. I walked onto the bridge itself, the steel grating cold under my boots. I listened. The creek rushed below, a constant murmur. I walked to the far end, sweeping the beam into the dense forest that bordered the floodplain. Nothing stirred. The isolation felt heavier than usual. I spent the rest of my shift in a heightened state of awareness. The patrol car arrived just before dawn, its headlights cutting through the retreating fog. 2 deputies, bundled in their uniforms, walked the bridge with me. They found nothing. No tracks, no discarded items, no sign of anyone having been there. They checked the mine access gates nearby, finding them secured. They drove the backroads for a few miles in each direction, reporting no unusual activity. The incident was logged as unexplained auditory phenomenon. I filed my own detailed report, including my field notes and the stopwatch readings. The bridge was temporarily closed for a few days, ostensibly for a structural inspection, though I suspected it was also a quiet investigation into my report. They found no structural issues. The incident was eventually filed away, becoming just another strange entry in the logbook of a remote outpost. I was reassigned to a different sector, away from the Holler bridge. I never heard the footsteps again, not directly. Sometimes late at night, when the wind howls just right, or the house settles with a groan, I still hear it. It's a faint, metallic ping, a sound that echoes in my memory, a reminder of something that crossed a bridge in the dark, just out of sight. I was a security guard working the night shift at the old Tipple No. 7. It was late autumn and the air was barely above freezing, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. The Tipple had been shut down for a scheduled test, but a low, persistent thrum echoed through the steel structure. My patrol began just past midnight, a routine sweep of the perimeter and interior processing areas. The facility sat deep in a holler, surrounded by dense forest and a winding gravel road that led back to the main highway. Headlights from my patrol vehicle cut through the thick fog that often settled in the lowlands, illuminating the skeletal framework of the Tipple against the dark sky. This particular night, the air felt heavy, almost static, despite the quiet. The scheduled shutdown meant the usual cacophony of machinery was absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. My job was to ensure no trespassers were on site and that all equipment remained secure. The thrumming sound was an immediate anomaly. It was not the full-throated roar of the main conveyors, but a subdued, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from deep within the structure. I noted it in my patrol log, a small irregularity in an otherwise predictable night. My routine was a familiar pattern of checks and observations. I would drive the perimeter road, checking the mine access gates and the old floodplains for any signs of recent activity. Then, I would park the vehicle near the main office and proceed on foot through the processing plant. This involved climbing several sets of stairs and traversing catwalks that snaked through the massive steel framework. The air inside always carried the fine, gritty scent of coal dust, even when the plant was idle. The cold metal underfoot would often creak and groan, settling noises that became part of the background hum of the isolated site. My radio would occasionally crackle with distant dispatch traffic, a faint whisper of the outside world. Most nights, the only other sounds were the wind whistling through the girders and the distant calls of forest animals. It was a solitary existence, demanding constant vigilance and a methodical approach to every task. The thrumming sound grew more distinct as I approached the main conveyor system. It was a deep, resonant vibration, almost like a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the very steel of the catwalk beneath my boots. I stopped at the base of the primary incline conveyor, listening intently. The sound was definitely coming from the housing of the main belt. This was unusual. The entire system had been powered down for a scheduled maintenance inspection and a full system test. There should have been no residual power, no movement, no sound at all. I pulled out my multimeter, checking the main power conduits leading to the conveyor motor. The readings showed no current flow, a flat zero. Yet, the thrum persisted, a palpable vibration that I could feel in my chest. I began to ascend the catwalk alongside the conveyor, my dust lamp cutting a beam through the ambient gloom. The thrum intensified with each step, a steady, rhythmic pulse. It felt like the conveyor was running, but at an incredibly slow, almost imperceptible speed. I reached the section where the sound was strongest, a long stretch of enclosed conveyor housing. I pressed my palm against the cold metal. The vibration was undeniable, a continuous, low-frequency tremor. I checked my watch. The thrum had been going on for a few minutes now. I considered calling dispatch, but what would I report? A phantom vibration? I decided to investigate further before raising an alarm. I walked the length of the conveyor, checking access panels, looking for any sign of a mechanical fault or a power surge. There was nothing visible. The housing remained sealed. The heavy chain links of the conveyor belt inside, completely still. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the thrum ceased. The silence that followed was absolute. A profound absence of sound that felt heavier than the previous vibration. I stood there for a moment, listening, my breath misting in the cold air. The only sound now was the faint hiss of my own breathing. I checked my watch again. The thrum had lasted for exactly 40 seconds. I made a note in my patrol log detailing the time and duration. As I turned to descend the catwalk, my dust lamp beam swept across the metal grating. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were distinct, clear impressions in the fine layer of coal dust that coated the catwalk. The prints were not from my boots. Mine were larger, with a different tread pattern. These were smaller, narrower, and appeared to be from a work boot, perhaps a size 9 or 10. The most unsettling detail was their placement. They began abruptly in the middle of the catwalk, about a dozen steps from where I was standing. There were no preceding prints, no smudges, nothing to indicate someone had walked to that point. They simply started. The prints continued in a straight line, heading towards a ladder void that led down to a lower level of the plant. I followed them, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. Each print was perfectly formed, showing the distinct pattern of a sole. They ended abruptly at the edge of the ladder void. There were no prints on the ladder rungs, no scuff marks on the steel frame, and no prints on the lower level catwalk that I could see from above. It was as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. I stood at the edge of the void, shining my lamp down into the darkness. The lower level was empty, just more steel and machinery. all coated in a uniform layer of dust. There was no sign of disturbance. I looked back at the prints. They were undeniable, solid evidence of someone having been there. Yet, the way they started and ended defied logic. I checked my radio, ensuring it was on and functioning. The static crackled faintly, a small comfort in the sudden isolation. I took out my company-issued camera and photographed the prints, capturing their precise location and appearance. The cold air felt sharper now, carrying a different kind of chill. I immediately began a more thorough sweep of the entire tipple. I checked all access points, every door, every gate, every window. All were secured, just as I had left them. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no disturbed seals. I climbed down to the lower level, retracing the path the prints would have taken had they continued. The dust there was undisturbed, a smooth, unbroken blanket. I checked the maintenance sheet for the day. No personnel were scheduled to be on site after the shutdown test. The test itself had concluded hours earlier, and the crew had left the premises. I walked the perimeter again, shining my headlights into the dense forest surrounding the facility. The gravel crunched under my tires, the only sound for miles. I even checked the old cabin near the floodplains, a derelict structure sometimes used by local kids. It was empty, the door still boarded shut. The lack of any logical explanation was the most unsettling part. I considered the possibility of an animal, but the prints were clearly human. I thought about a prank, but the precision of the prints and the complete absence of any other evidence made that seem unlikely. The isolation of the tipple, deep in the holler, meant that any trespasser would have had to travel a significant distance on foot or by vehicle. Yet there was no evidence of either. I returned to the catwalk, examining the prints again. They remained, stark and clear in the dust. I ran my gloved hand over the surface of the catwalk near where the prints began. The dust was undisturbed, a fine, even layer. It was as if someone had materialized mid-stride. I made a detailed report in my logbook, documenting the thrum, its duration, and the discovery of the footprints. I attached the photographs to the file. The next morning, when the maintenance crew arrived, I showed them the prints. They were as puzzled as I was. The foreman, a man who had worked in the mines for decades, simply shook his head. He checked a conveyor system thoroughly, finding no mechanical faults, no electrical issues, and no explanation for the 40-second thrum. The prints were eventually swept away during the routine cleaning of the catwalks. My report was filed, marked as unexplained incident. No further action was taken. The company security office reviewed the log and the photographs, but there was nothing to pursue. The incident simply became another strange entry in the long history of the old tipple. I continued to work the night shift there for several more months. Every time I patrolled that catwalk, I would instinctively look for new prints. The thrum never returned, but the memory of those footprints, appearing from nowhere and vanishing into nothing, stayed with me. I still hear that low, resonant hum sometimes, late at night, in the quiet. It's a sound that seems to vibrate just beneath the surface of everything. I was the night foreman for the mining operation. It was a cold, clear night in the Appalachian foothills. The first irregularity was a radio key on an unused channel. My shift had begun just after sundown. The air carried a sharp chill, barely above freezing. I had driven the perimeter in my company truck, checking the main gate and the secondary access points. The mine itself was quiet, operations having ceased for the night. My job involved monitoring the site, responding to alarms, and ensuring security until the morning crew arrived. I carried a VHF handheld radio, tuned to the company's private frequencies. The truck's radio was also on, a low hum of static filling the cabin. I was about to head back to the main office to review the overnight logbook when the radio crackled. It was a brief, distinct key click, then silence. The sound came from the gate channel, a frequency reserved for personnel at the main access gate. My routine was well established, honed over years of night shifts. I knew the rhythms of the mine, the sounds of the forest around it. The main gate was secured with a heavy chain and a company-issued lock. A trail camera monitored the approach, its motion sensor set to capture any activity. I had checked that gate less than an hour before. Everything had been in order. The gravel road leading to it was undisturbed. The gate channel was rarely used after hours, only for emergencies or specific instructions from dispatch. The click was unusual because it lacked a unit number. Every transmission was supposed to begin with an identifier. I waited for a voice, for a unit to call in. Nothing followed the key click. I checked my handheld, then the truck's radio. Both were functioning correctly. I tried to raise dispatch, but they were quiet, likely dealing with other sites. I keyed my mic, asking for a unit check on the gate channel. There was no response. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I considered it a momentary glitch, perhaps a faulty mic button on someone's handheld. Still, the protocol dictated a physical check. I turned the truck around, its headlights cutting through the night fog that had begun to settle in the lower elevations. The drive back to the main gate took a few minutes. The fog grew thicker as I approached the gate, reducing visibility to a few truck lengths. My headlights struggled to penetrate the swirling mist. I slowed the truck, peering through the windshield. The gate itself slowly materialized out of the whiteout. It stood as it should, the heavy chain wrapped around the posts, the lock secured. I pulled up close, parking the truck so its lights illuminated the gate. I stepped out into the cold, the air damp and still. The only sound was the low hum of the truck's engine and the distant, faint whisper of the wind through the forest. I walked directly to the chain, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. That's when I saw it. The chain, a thick, galvanized steel link, had fresh marks. They were not scratches from impact or wear. They were arc scuffs, small, blackened areas where metal had been heated and scored, as if by an electrical discharge or intense friction. The marks were recent, distinct against the dull gray of the chain. They were located near the locking mechanism, on the links that would be under the most tension. I ran my gloved hand over them. The texture was rough, slightly raised in places. This was not normal wear and tear. This suggested a struggle with the lock, or an attempt to compromise it with a tool that generated heat. I checked the lock itself. It was still secure, the shackle firmly in place. There were no visible marks on the lock body. The arc scuffs were confined to the chain links. I looked around the immediate area. The gravel was undisturbed. No fresh tire tracks or footprints visible in the dim light. The fog seemed to absorb all sound, creating a profound sense of isolation. I felt a prickle of unease. The radio key, the arc scuffs. These were connected. Someone had been at the gate, and they had not been authorized. My next step was to check the trail camera. It was mounted on a tree about 20 feet from the gate, angled to capture anyone approaching. I retrieved the camera, unmounting it carefully. I needed to check the memory card. The camera was a standard model, motion activated, designed to operate in all weather conditions. I took it back to the truck, the cold seeping into my bones. Inside the cabin, I inserted the memory card into my laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying the camera's interface. I navigated to the recent files. The last recorded event was a sequence of images from about an hour earlier, roughly the time of the radio key. The first few frames showed the gate, clear and undisturbed. Then, a sudden, intense whiteout. The entire frame was overexposed, a blinding flash of light that lasted for several frames. It wasn't a camera flash. It was as if a powerful light source had been directed straight into the lens, overwhelming the sensor. After the whiteout, the images went black. Not just dark, but completely black, as if the camera had ceased to function or had been covered. The sequence ended there. There were no images of anyone approaching or leaving the gate. The camera had simply gone blind, then dark. I reviewed the sequence several times. The whiteout was too uniform, too intense to be a natural light source like headlights. It was a deliberate act, or the result of a very specific type of interference. The black frames suggested either a power failure to the camera or something physically blocking its view. Yet, when I retrieved the camera, it was still mounted, its indicator light off, but otherwise intact. It had not been tampered with physically, at least not in a way that left obvious marks. The memory card was still in place. I radioed dispatch again, this time with a more urgent tone. I reported the unexplained radio key, the arc scuffs on the chain, and the trail camera anomaly. Dispatch acknowledged, their voice calm but with an underlying note of concern. They instructed me to secure the area and await the sheriff's department. I was to remain in my truck, keeping the gate in sight. The fog had thickened further, making it difficult to see more than a few feet beyond my headlights. The isolation of the forest pressed in. I sat in the truck, engine idling, heater on low. My eyes scanned the perimeter, trying to pierce the fog. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the forest sounded amplified. I kept the handheld radio close, listening to the static. The gate channel remained silent. It was a long wait. About an hour passed before I saw the distant blue flash of emergency lights. The sheriff's patrol car approached slowly, its lights painting the fog in shifting hues. 2 deputies emerged, their breath pluming in the cold air. I explained everything again, pointing out the arc scuffs on the chain. One deputy photographed the marks with a digital camera. The other deputy examined the lock and the surrounding ground. They found nothing new, no footprints or tire tracks that I had missed. The fog had likely obscured any such evidence. We then reviewed the trail camera footage together on my laptop. The deputies were equally perplexed by the whiteout and subsequent black frames. They confirmed the camera was physically undamaged. They filed a report. The incident was logged as an attempted trespass and possible vandalism, though the lack of actual damage to the lock made the vandalism charge tenuous. The arc scuffs were noted as unexplained marks. The radio key was attributed to unknown interference. They took the memory card as evidence. I was instructed to replace the chain and lock in the morning, despite the current ones being intact. The deputies stayed for a while longer, patrolling the immediate area, before leaving me alone again with the quiet forest. The next morning, I replaced the chain and lock as instructed. The old chain, with its strange arc scuffs, was tagged and placed in the evidence locker. The trail camera was remounted, a new memory card inserted. The incident was logged in the company's security file. There were no further developments. No one was apprehended. The official explanation remained vague, a series of coincidences. The company increased patrols for a few weeks, but eventually, things returned to the usual rhythm. I still work the night shift. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick, or when the radio crackles with static, I think about that night. I still hear that brief, distinct key click on the gate channel. I still see the whiteout flash on the camera, followed by the absolute black. The memory of those arc scuffs on the chain and the profound silence of the forest stays with me. I was a county plow driver, working the night shift through the winding roads of the coal country. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp, damp chill, barely above freezing. That night, a thick, low fog had settled over the floodplain bypass, obscuring everything beyond the reach of my headlights. My route covered the old state highway, a stretch known for its sudden dips and narrow Holler bridges. The county had recently closed a section of the highway for repairs, diverting traffic onto a temporary bypass that ran closer to the river. This bypass was a gravel track, prone to flooding, but it cut through a less populated area, avoiding the old company towns. My job involved checking road conditions, clearing minor debris, and occasionally spreading salt if frost began to form. I had been on this route for nearly a decade, and the rhythm of the night, the hum of the truck's engine, and the static on the radio were familiar companions. I knew every curve, every pothole, every abandoned mine access gate along these trails. The fog had been a constant presence since sundown. It was a heavy, wet fog that dripped from the trees and coated the windshield, forcing me to run the wipers constantly. Visibility was poor, reduced to perhaps a few truck lengths ahead. The air inside the cabin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold outside. I kept the radio tuned to dispatch, listening to the low chatter of other drivers and emergency services. It was a quiet night otherwise, just the usual reports of deer on the road or minor fender benders in town. I had just passed the turnoff for the old Tipples, a cluster of abandoned coal processing plants, when I approached the floodplain bypass. The detour was marked by a series of orange traffic drums and reflective plastic markers, clearly visible even in the dense fog. I slowed the plow truck, letting the engine idle as I approached the closed section of the main highway. The detour itself was a temporary gravel road, running parallel to the river, a little lower than the main highway. It was a necessary evil during the repairs. My headlights cut through the thick, wet air, illuminating the orange drums and the reflective markers that lined the closed lane. I noticed something immediately. The plastic markers, the tall, flexible ones with the reflective bands, were swaying. They moved back and forth, a slow, deliberate motion, like reeds in a gentle current. This was unusual. I stopped the truck completely, engaging the parking brake. I had a small, handheld anemometer in the cabin, a standard piece of equipment for checking wind speed before spreading salt. I rolled down my window, letting the cold, damp air rush in. The fog felt heavy and still. I held the anemometer out, away from the truck's cabin. The digital display remained at 0. There was no wind. Not even a whisper. The air was absolutely motionless. Yet, the markers continued their slow, rhythmic sway, perhaps a foot or so in each direction. It was a silent, unsettling dance in the fog. I watched them for a few minutes, my breath misting in the cold air. The movement was consistent. It wasn't a sudden gust, but a steady, almost deliberate oscillation. I checked the anemometer again. Still 0. I looked at the markers on the open detour lane, the ones guiding traffic around the closure. They were perfectly still, rigid in the fog. Only the markers on the closed lane, the ones blocking access to the repair zone, were moving. I reached for my dash cam, ensuring it was recording. It was standard procedure to document unusual road conditions. The camera captured the swaying markers, the dense fog, and the motionless air. As I watched, a new sound emerged from the distance. It was a horn, a deep, resonant blast, like a train horn. It came from the direction of the old, disused rail spur that ran through the floodplain, a line that hadn't seen a train in decades. The sound was muffled by the fog, but it was distinct. It repeated after a short pause, a long, mournful sound that seemed to hang in the damp air. I checked my radio. No reports of trains in the area. The rail spur was officially abandoned, its tracks overgrown with weeds and brush. I had never heard a horn from that direction before, not in all my years on this route. The horn sounded a third time, a little fainter now, as if moving away. The markers continued their sway. I felt a cold prickle on my skin, despite the warm cabin. It was not fear exactly, but a deep sense of unease. The situation defied explanation. I decided to get out and inspect the markers more closely. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and stepped out into the cold. The ground was damp gravel, slick with fog drip. The air was silent except for the distant, fading echo of the horn. I walked towards the swaying markers, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. As I approached, the movement seemed to lessen, becoming more subtle. When I was within a few feet, they stopped swaying entirely. They stood rigid, just like the markers on the open lane. I ran my hand over the plastic, feeling the cold, smooth texture. There was no vibration, no loose base, nothing to suggest a mechanical fault. I pushed one gently. It flexed and returned to its upright position. I stepped back a few paces, still no movement. I walked back to the truck, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog. As I reached the driver's side door, I glanced back. The markers began to sway again, slowly, rhythmically, just as before. It was as if my presence had paused their activity. The horn did not sound again. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of moisture from the trees. I got back into the truck, my mind racing through possible explanations. A localized air current? But the anemometer showed 0. A trick of the light in the fog? But the movement was too clear, too consistent. I pulled out my logbook and began to write a detailed report. I noted the time, the location, the zero wind reading, and the observed swaying of the markers. I also documented the distant horn, specifying its direction and repetition. I made sure the dashcam was still recording. I then called dispatch. I kept my voice calm, factual. I reported unusual conditions on the floodplain bypass, swaying markers on the closed lane, no wind, and an unexplained horn sound from the old rail spur. Dispatch acknowledged my report, their voice calm and professional. They said they would log it and notify the county sheriff's department for a possible investigation in the morning. I was instructed to proceed with my route, but to exercise caution. I drove slowly through the bypass, keeping my eyes on the markers. They continued their silent, rhythmic dance in my rearview mirror until the fog swallowed them. The rest of my shift was uneventful. I completed my route, spreading salt on a few icy patches near the higher elevations. The fog eventually lifted as dawn approached, revealing a clear, cold morning. The next day, I submitted my official report, attaching the dashcam footage and my logbook entries. The county sheriff's department sent a deputy to investigate. They found no evidence of tampering with the markers, no footprints in the gravel, no explanation for the horn. The rail spur was still overgrown and unused. The deputy noted the zero wind reading from my anemometer, but offered no theory for the swaying. The incident was filed as unexplained. The markers were eventually replaced during the highway repairs, but the new ones never swayed. I still drive that route sometimes, though I am no longer on the night shift. The floodplain bypass is now a permanent part of the highway, paved and widened. The old rail spur remains abandoned, silent. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I remember the swaying markers and the distant horn. I remember the absolute stillness of the air and the inexplicable movement. I still hear it sometimes, that low, mournful sound, echoing from a place that should be quiet. I worked as a code inspector for the county. It was a cold, clear night in late autumn. I noticed the porch light flicker as I approached the vacant company house. My assignment that evening involved a routine check of abandoned properties. The house stood on the edge of a floodplain, a few miles past the last active mine access gate. The air carried the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. My headlights cut through the deep shadows of the Holler, illuminating the overgrown trail leading to the property. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires of my truck. This particular structure was part of an old company row, slated for demolition in the coming months. It had been empty for a long time, its windows dark and vacant. I had a work order to verify its structural integrity and secure any open points of entry. The porch light, a single bare bulb, was supposed to be off. Its unexpected flicker was the first small deviation from the expected. I parked and retrieved my body camera from the dashboard. The cold seeped into the truck cabin as I opened the door, a sharp contrast to the interior warmth. I clipped the camera to my vest, ensuring the recording indicator glowed steady green. My job often took me into isolated areas. These old company towns, now mostly ghost settlements, dotted the landscape. They were remnants of a bygone era, slowly reclaiming by the forest. My routine involved documenting conditions, photographing damage, and ensuring no unauthorized entry. I carried a standard kit: flashlight, light tester, a small pry bar, and a two-way radio for dispatch contact. The radio usually crackled with static in these remote locations. I preferred working at night for these inspections. It minimized the chance of encountering squatters or trespassers. The darkness also made it easier to spot any light sources that shouldn't be present. I had inspected hundreds of similar houses over the years. Each one presented its own set of challenges, but they rarely offered surprises beyond structural decay or animal infestations. My logbook contained entries for everything from collapsing roofs to nests of raccoons. I had learned to approach each site with a methodical, detached perspective. This particular house, according to the occupancy log, had been empty for well over a decade. Its last registered resident had moved out after the mine closed down. The property had since fallen into county ownership, awaiting its final disposition. I stepped out of the truck, the cold air biting at my exposed skin. The porch light remained on, a dim yellow glow against the night. I walked towards the house, my boots crunching on the frozen gravel. As I reached the edge of the small, unkempt yard, the light flickered once, then settled back into its steady hum. I paused, watching it. There was no wind, and the power grid in this area was generally stable. I made a mental note to check the wiring later. I continued my approach, stepping onto the wooden porch. The moment my weight settled on the first plank, the bulb brightened slightly, then held its steady output. It was a subtle change, barely perceptible, but I registered it. I pulled out my light tester, a small device designed to check voltage and continuity. The reading was normal for a standard incandescent bulb. I took a photograph of the porch and the illuminated bulb with my camera. I moved to the front door, checking the lock. It was a heavy, old wooden door, secured with a deadbolt. I tried the handle, but it held firm. As I stood there, a distinct sound came from inside the house. It was a series of 3 knocks. They were solid, deliberate thuds against an interior wall, sounding like knuckles on wood. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was clear, originating from what I estimated to be the living room area, just beyond the door. I froze, listening. The house was supposed to be vacant. There was no record of anyone being inside. I checked my body camera to ensure it was still recording. The green light was steady. I waited, listening for any further sounds. There was only the quiet hum of the porch light and the distant whisper of the wind through the forest. I waited for what felt like a long time, perhaps a few minutes. Nothing else happened. I considered calling dispatch, but I had no immediate threat to report, only an unusual sound. I decided to complete my exterior inspection first. I walked around the perimeter of the house, shining my flashlight into every window. Each pane was grimy, but intact. The back door was also secured. I checked the foundation for cracks and the siding for rot. The cold was persistent, making my fingers stiff. I completed my circuit, returning to the front porch. I stepped back onto the first plank. The porch light, which had remained steady, flickered once again. It was the same single brief flicker I had observed earlier. Then it returned to its constant glow. I stood there watching the bulb. I waited. After a period that I estimated to be around 12 minutes, the interior knocks repeated. Thud, thud, thud. They were identical to the first set, coming from the same location inside the house. The timing was precise. I felt a cold prickle on my neck. This was not a random occurrence. I stepped off the porch, moving into the yard. The porch light remained steady. I waited another 12 minutes, standing in the cold. Nothing happened. I stepped back onto the porch, The light flickered once. I waited. After another 12 minutes, the knocks came again. Thud, thud, thud. This sequence was now undeniable. 3 knocks inside, every 12 minutes, synchronized with a single flicker of the porch light, only when I was physically on the porch. The light would then burn steady until I stepped off and returned. I had never encountered anything like it. My procedural training offered no explanation for such an event. I checked my radio, but the static was too strong for a clear transmission. I needed to document this thoroughly. I decided to conduct a more controlled observation. I positioned myself in the yard about 20 feet from the porch. My body camera was still recording. I noted the exact time of the next set of knocks in my mental log. When the 12-minute interval passed, the knocks occurred as expected. Thud, thud, thud. The porch light, however, did not flicker. It remained steadily illuminated. This confirmed my earlier observation. The light only reacted when I was on the porch itself. I stepped back onto the porch. The light flickered once, then held steady. I waited another 12 minutes. The knocks came again, precisely on schedule. Thud, thud, thud. I repeated this process several times, stepping on and off the porch, observing the light and listening for the knocks. Each time, the pattern held. The light flickered only when I was on the porch. The knocks occurred every 12 minutes, regardless of my position. But the light's behavior was tied to my presence on the structure. I considered the possibilities. A faulty electrical circuit might explain the flickering, but not its synchronization with my presence or the internal knocks. A timer could trigger the knocks, but how would it sense my position on the porch? There was no visible sensor, no pressure plate. The house was old, but not equipped with any advanced systems. I used my light tester again, checking the socket and the bulb itself. The readings were consistent. The bulb was a standard incandescent, not a smart bulb or anything unusual. I tried to locate the source of the knocks more precisely. I pressed my ear against the front door. The wood was cold and rough. When the next set of knocks occurred, they sounded muffled but still distinct, originating from the same central area. I moved to a side window, trying to peer through the grimy glass. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the interior darkness. I could discern only vague shapes of furniture draped in dust sheets. The knocks seemed to come from deeper within the house, not directly against the window. I called dispatch on my radio again. The static was still heavy, but I managed to transmit a brief, garbled message about an unusual situation and requested a supervisor. I knew it would take a while for anyone to arrive, given the isolation of the location. I continued my observations. I even tried knocking on the door myself, a series of 3 knocks, to see if it would trigger a response. It did not. The internal rhythm remained undisturbed. The house seemed to operate on its own schedule, independent of my direct interaction, yet subtly reacting to my presence. The cold continued to deepen, and a thin fog began to roll in from the floodplain, obscuring the distant tree line. The isolation felt more pronounced. I spent another hour documenting the phenomenon. I recorded several cycles of the knocks and the light flicker with my body camera. The evidence was clear and consistent. I had a series of video clips showing the porch light flickering the moment I stepped onto the porch, followed by the 3 interior knocks about 12 minutes later. Then, if I stepped off, The light would remain steady, and the knocks would still occur, but without the flicker. It was a precise, unsettling mechanism. My supervisor arrived a little past midnight, accompanied by a local sheriff's deputy. The fog had thickened considerably by then. I explained the situation, playing back the body camera footage. They listened, their expressions unreadable in the dim light of their vehicle's headlights. We approached the house together. As we stepped onto the porch, the light flickered once, just as it had for me. We waited. After the familiar 12-minute interval, the 3 knocks sounded from within the house. Thud, thud, thud. The deputy tried the door, then the windows. Everything remained secured. My supervisor instructed me to file a detailed report, including the body camera evidence. The official logbook entry noted, "Unexplained auditory and electrical phenomena." The house was deemed unsafe for further inspection until a more thorough investigation could be conducted. The incident was logged, the property secured with additional locks, and a "Do Not Enter" notice posted. The file was marked for review by a specialized team, though I never heard of any follow-up. I submitted my report and the video evidence. The incident was closed on my end. I never returned to that specific company house. The property was eventually demolished, as planned, a few months later. I saw the demolition crew's report in the county file. It made no mention of anything unusual found during the teardown. Yet, the memory of those precise interior knocks remains. Sometimes, late at night, when I am alone in a quiet room, I still hear them. The faint, rhythmic thud, thud, thud against an unseen wall. I was a station tech, performing routine checks on decommissioned equipment. It was late autumn, a cold night, with a thick fog rolling in from the floodplain. The old way display, long since powered down, showed a single, faint digit. My job involved maintaining the infrastructure of old mining operations, even those long since abandoned. This particular way station sat on a forgotten stretch of gravel road, deep in the Appalachian foothills. The company had closed it down years ago, but the structures remained, slowly decaying. My task that night was to verify the power cutoff to the main console and document its condition. The air inside the small, unheated booth was barely above freezing, and my breath plumed in the dim light of my headlamp. I had driven for about an hour from the nearest town, navigating winding Holler bridges and narrow trails. The isolation was absolute, broken only by the occasional static from my handheld radio. The faint digit on the display was a surprise. It was a single, glowing segment, forming the top bar of what could have been a 7 or a 1. The console was supposed to be completely dead. I had already confirmed the main breaker was thrown at the nearby access gate. I tapped the heavy, dust-covered casing of the display unit. Nothing changed. The segment remained, a pale green against the dark faceplate. I checked my power probe, ensuring it was functioning correctly. The probe showed no current flowing to the display. This was the first irregularity, a small detail that did not fit the established facts. The hum of the distant power lines was the only sound outside the booth, a low, steady vibration in the cold night. My routine was usually straightforward. I would arrive at a site, log my entry, perform a series of power and structural checks, and then file a report. This way station had been on the list for a final assessment before potential demolition. It was a relic, a concrete and steel shell from an era when coal trucks rumbled through here day and night. The booth itself was cramped, smelling of damp concrete and old electronics. The console was a heavy, industrial piece designed for durability, not aesthetics. Its buttons were stiff, its dials frozen in place. I usually spent about an hour at these sites, meticulously documenting every detail, taking photographs of wiring and structural integrity. The only light came from my headlamp and a small battery-powered lantern I carried. The cold seeped through my heavy work jacket, making my fingers stiff. The silence of the place was usually profound, broken only by the wind or the distant call of an owl. Tonight, the fog muffled even those sounds. My radio crackled occasionally with distant dispatch traffic, a faint, unintelligible whisper that only emphasized the isolation. I had parked my truck a little way down the gravel road, its headlights cutting through the thick fog like dull knives. The forest pressed in on all sides, a dark, silent presence. I had brought a thermos of hot coffee, a small comfort against the pervasive cold. My work was procedural, methodical. There was rarely anything unexpected, just the slow decay of abandoned industry. This was why the single glowing digit felt so out of place. It was a deviation from the expected, a minor glitch in a system that should have been entirely inert. I tried to dismiss it as residual charge or a faulty capacitor, but the probe showed nothing. I continued my checks, moving around the small booth, inspecting the wiring conduits and the structural integrity of the concrete slab. The air grew colder, and a thin layer of frost began to form on the metal surfaces inside the booth. When I returned to the console, the display had changed. The single segment was gone. In its place, a full digit glowed, then another, then a third. They were advancing, slowly, deliberately. The numbers formed a sequence, a series of digits that looked like a truck ID. There was a faint, almost imperceptible click each time a digit changed. A sound like old relays engaging. It was a mechanical sound, not electronic. I stood still, watching. My breath hitched in the cold air. The sequence continued, forming a complete ID number, then clearing, then starting again. It was a repeating pattern, about 5 digits long, followed by a pause, then another sequence. The display was not just showing random numbers, it was cycling through a specific set of data. I pulled out my phone, fumbling with the cold metal, and started recording. The video would be evidence, something to show the office. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A short circuit? A phantom power source? But the probe still showed no current. The clicks were regular, rhythmic, like a slow, deliberate count. The numbers glowed with an eerie green light, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the beam of my headlamp. I remembered seeing old shift sheets in the archives, paper records of truck IDs and weights from decades ago. The pattern on the display seemed familiar, like something from those old logbooks. I watched for several minutes, the cold seeping into my bones, the rhythmic clicking the only sound in the booth. The display cycled through the same sequence about 3 times. Then, it paused. The digits held steady for a moment, then shifted. A new sequence began, different from the first. This one was longer, about 7 digits. It advanced slowly, one number at a time, each accompanied by that faint, mechanical click. The air in the booth felt heavier, colder. I could feel a prickle on the back of my neck. The new sequence completed, forming a distinct ID. Then, instead of clearing, it froze. The numbers remained, glowing steadily. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. It was a personnel ID, not a truck ID. The format was different, a specific combination of letters and numbers used for individual workers. My heart began to pound a little faster. This was beyond a simple electrical glitch. I tried to touch the display, but hesitated. The cold metal of the console felt somehow charged, even though my probe showed nothing. The frozen ID stared back at me, an unblinking green eye in the dark. The silence that followed the last click was profound, almost suffocating. I needed to confirm what I was seeing. I packed up my equipment quickly, the cold making my movements clumsy. I drove back to the main office, the fog still thick on the highway, my headlights barely penetrating the gloom. The drive felt longer than usual, the isolation more pronounced. The frozen image of the ID on the display was burned into my mind. I arrived at the office a little past midnight, the building dark and empty. I went straight to the archives, a dusty room filled with old company records. I knew where to find the old shift sheets and personnel files. It took me about an hour, sifting through brittle paper and faded ink, cross-referencing the format of the ID I had seen. I found it. The ID matched an entry from a shift sheet dated nearly 50 years ago. It belonged to a worker named Thomas Miller. I remembered the name. There was a small, overgrown cemetery on the ridge above the old way station, a place where many of the early miners were buried. Thomas Miller was one of them. He had died in a mining accident, a roof collapse, decades ago. The realization hit me with a physical force. The display had not just shown a random number. It had displayed the ID of a man long dead, a man buried just a short distance from where I had been standing. I replayed the phone video I had taken. The sequence, the freeze, it was all there, clear as day. I felt a profound sense of unease, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The procedural nature of my work offered no explanation for this. I had evidence, a video, and a confirmed match from the archives. I filed a detailed report the next morning, attaching the video and the photocopied archive sheet. My supervisor listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He suggested a thorough electrical inspection of the way station, citing potential residual current or a unique atmospheric condition affecting the old circuitry. He was a practical man, grounded in logic. The display unit was eventually removed, deemed irreparable and a potential safety hazard. It was replaced with a blank panel. The official explanation was a complex interaction of electromagnetic fields and degraded components, a rare but plausible technical anomaly. My video was considered interesting but not conclusive. There was no further investigation into the specific ID. I understood the need for a rational explanation. My job required it, but the memory of those slow, deliberate clicks, the way the digits formed Thomas Miller's ID, remained with me. I never returned to that specific way station. The company eventually demolished the entire structure, clearing the land. Sometimes, late at night, when I am driving on a lonely highway, I still hear that faint, rhythmic clicking sound. It is a quiet whisper in the back of my mind, a reminder of something that defied all logic. I remember the cold, the fog, and the green glow of those numbers. I worked as a tow operator in the Appalachian foothills. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp chill that night. My CB radio crackled with an unusual transmission that seemed to come from nowhere. My shift had started like any other, just after dusk. The roads through the old coal country were often deserted, especially after midnight. I was parked in a turnout bay, a small gravel patch off a winding state highway. This spot was a common waiting point for calls from the dispatch office. My rig, a heavy-duty wrecker, idled softly, its engine a low hum in the quiet night. The cabin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold outside. I had a thermos of coffee and a paperback novel, ready for a long stretch of waiting. The area was known for its deep hollers and steep hillsides, remnants of past mining operations. Fog often settled in the low spots, making visibility difficult. My CB set was always on, tuned to channel 12, the local truckers' frequency. It was usually just static or the occasional late-night chatter. My routine was simple and predictable. I would check my equipment, ensure the truck was fueled, and then settle in. The radio was a constant companion, a link to the outside world in these isolated stretches. I kept a small RF meter connected to the CB, a habit from years of troubleshooting signal issues. It would show the strength of incoming transmissions. Most signals were weak out here, bouncing off the terrain. The antenna on my truck was a standard whip, mounted on the rear of the cabin. It was pointed generally towards the highway, but its reach was limited by the surrounding mountains. I knew the dead zones well, places where even a strong signal would simply vanish. This particular turnout was one such spot, nestled against a sheer rock face that should have blocked most transmissions from the west. The first time it happened, I almost dismissed it. A voice, low and gravelly, came through the speaker. It said, "Wrong way." There was a distinct wet cough immediately after the words. Then silence. My RF meter needle did not move. It stayed flat, indicating no incoming signal strength. I checked the squelch, thinking it might be a weak skip, but everything was set correctly. I looked at the meter again. It was still dead. The voice had been clear, not muffled by static, yet the meter registered nothing. I waited, listening to the normal hiss of the channel. A few minutes passed. Then, the same voice, the same two words, the same cough. "Wrong way," cough. Again, the meter remained flat. This was unusual. Any transmission, no matter how weak, would cause the needle to flicker. I tried to raise the caller, keying my mic. "Breaker, breaker, this is tow 1. Who's on the channel?" There was no response, only the steady hiss. I tried again, waiting longer this time. Nothing. The air outside felt colder now, despite the cabin heater. I looked out at the dark forest beyond the highway. The fog was starting to roll in, obscuring the distant tree line. The silence stretched, broken only by the truck's engine and the radio's low hum. Then, for a third time, the voice returned. "Wrong way," cough. It was identical to the previous two. The cadence, the tone, the specific sound of the cough. It was an exact repeat. My hand went to the RF meter, still flat. This was not a weak signal. This was something else. I pulled out my small audio recorder, a handheld device I sometimes used to log unusual radio traffic for my own records. I pressed record, placing it near the CB speaker. I sat there, listening intently. The transmission repeated every few minutes, always the same. "Wrong way," cough. The words were calm, almost monotone, but the repetition began to grate. It felt like a loop, a broken record playing over the airwaves. I checked my antenna connection, even though I knew it was secure. I scanned other channels, finding only the usual distant chatter or dead air. When I returned to channel 12, the voice was there again. Wrong way. Cough. The consistency was unnerving. There was no variation in pitch or speed. It was a perfect echo of itself. I considered the possibility of a prank, but the lack of an RF signature made it impossible for a conventional CB radio. A prankster would have to be nearby, and their signal would register. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a powerful flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The cold hit me immediately. A thin layer of frost was beginning to form on the truck's metal surfaces. I walked around to the rear of the cabin, examining the antenna. It was firmly in place, pointing generally towards the west, directly into the massive rock face that formed the side of the Holler. There was no way a signal could penetrate that much solid rock and still be clear. I walked a few paces away from the truck, listening. The voice was still coming from the CB speaker, audible even from outside. Wrong way. Cough. It was as if the sound was originating from within the truck itself, not from an external source. I got back into the cabin, feeling a growing unease. I disconnected the antenna from the CB unit. The radio was now effectively deaf to outside signals. I waited. The hiss continued, but the voice did not return. I reconnected the antenna. Within moments, the voice was back. Wrong way. Cough. This confirmed the signal was external, but how? I checked the RF meter again, tapping it gently. It was functioning correctly. I even tried a different channel for a moment, then switched back. The voice was always there, waiting. I pulled out a map of the area, tracing the winding roads. The nearest mine access gate was about 3 miles further up the highway, but it was closed and locked. There were no other vehicles visible on the road, no headlights approaching from either direction. The isolation of the place felt heavier now. I started the truck and slowly drove a short distance down the highway, then turned around and came back to the turnout. The voice continued its loop. Wrong way. Cough. I drove past the turnout, heading east for about a mile, then pulled over. The signal persisted. I drove west, towards the rock face, past the mine access road. The voice followed. It was not fading or strengthening with distance. It was constant, as if the source was everywhere, or nowhere. I pulled over again, near an old, abandoned tipple structure, its silhouette dark against the faint moonlight. I recorded more of the transmission. The cold was seeping into my bones. The static hiss of the radio seemed to amplify the silence of the forest. I spent the next hour driving in slow circles, trying to triangulate the source, but it was useless. The RF meter never moved. The voice never changed. It was always wrong way. I finally called dispatch, keeping my voice calm. I reported an unusual radio interference, describing the repeating transmission and the lack of a meter reading. The dispatcher, a seasoned veteran, sounded skeptical, but logged my report. She suggested I try a different channel or simply turn off the radio if it was bothering me. I explained the specifics, the impossible nature of the signal. She said she would make a note of it in the logbook. I knew there was nothing she could do. I eventually drove back to the turnout, defeated. I turned off the CB radio. The silence was immediate and profound. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the cabin warm. The recorded audio on my handheld device was the only evidence. I listened to it a few times. The voice was clear, the cough unmistakable. It was a chilling sound in the quiet of the truck. I made a detailed report for my company, attaching the audio file. The supervisor listened to it, then filed it under unexplained radio phenomena. There was no follow-up, no investigation. The local authorities were never involved. It was just another strange incident in the remote backroads. I still work those same roads and I still use Channel 12. I have never heard that particular transmission again. But sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls in and the static is heavy, I think I can almost hear that low voice and that distinct, wet cough just at the edge of my hearing. I was a county electrician, checking a remote signal box near the old Tipple Creek crossing. It was late autumn, well past midnight, and a thin fog hung low over the floodplain. The red pilot light, which should have been off, glowed steadily. My truck idled on the gravel shoulder, its headlights cutting weak beams into the mist. The air was barely above freezing, carrying the damp scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. I had been dispatched for a routine check, a reported intermittent signal drop from a sensor further up the Holler. This particular box controlled a warning light system for heavy equipment crossing the creek, a remnant from a defunct mining operation. The system was supposed to be in a standby state, indicated by a single green pilot light. The red light meant an active crossing, which was impossible at this hour and location. My job involved maintaining the county's electrical infrastructure, much of it aging and located in remote, forgotten corners of the region. These back roads often led to abandoned company towns or overgrown mine access gates. I knew these routes well, navigating by memory through the winding trails and past silent tipples. My routine was usually predictable. Diagnose, repair, log, and move on. The quiet hum of electrical equipment and the static of my radio were constant companions. I carried a standard kit: multimeter, infrared thermometer, various hand tools, and a heavy-duty flashlight. Safety protocols were ingrained, especially when working alone at night. I stepped out of the truck, the crunch of gravel under my boots loud in the stillness. The only other sound was the faint slap of water against the creek bank, barely audible through the fog. I walked towards the control box, a weather-beaten gray enclosure mounted on a steel post. The red pilot light pulsed with an unnerving consistency. As I approached, I saw the green pilot light was also on, though it was dim and flickering slightly. Both lights were illuminated, which was a state the system was not designed to achieve. This was the first true irregularity. I pulled on my work gloves and opened the box with my universal key. The interior was clean, the wiring orderly, and the relays sat in their usual positions. I expected to hear the faint click of a relay engaging or disengaging, but there was only silence. The system was designed to be audible. A distinct mechanical sound accompanied any change in state. I checked the main power input, then the output lines. Everything appeared normal, yet the lights told a different story. I pulled out my infrared thermometer and scanned the relays. They were all cool to the touch, registering ambient temperature. There was no sign of electrical activity or overheating. I checked the maintenance logbook, a small waterproof binder kept inside the box. The last entry was from a few months prior, a routine inspection by a colleague. No issues had been reported then. I ran a diagnostic on the control board. The internal indicators showed no fault codes. The system believed it was operating correctly, despite the contradictory pilot lights. I looked closer at the mounting bolts for the main relay panel. Each bolt had a small ring of paint around its head, a standard practice to indicate if it had been tampered with or loosened. These rings were broken, showing fresh rotation. Someone had been inside this box very recently. The implications settled over me like the cold fog. Someone had opened the box, adjusted something, and then closed it back up. But why? And how had they managed to swap the pilot light states without triggering the relays or leaving any thermal signature? I examined the wiring for the pilot lights themselves. They were simple circuits, directly controlled by the main relay logic. There was no obvious way to bypass the relays and manually switch the lights without leaving physical evidence of a splice or a jumper. I took a series of photographs with my phone, documenting the broken paint rings, the illuminated lights, and the cool relays. I decided to cycle the power to the box, a standard troubleshooting step. I flipped the main breaker, plunging the area into complete darkness for a moment. The creak sounds seemed louder, the isolation more profound. After a count of about 30 seconds, I flipped the breaker back on. The box hummed back to life. The green pilot light came on, steady and bright. The red pilot light remained off. The system was now in its correct standby state. I waited, watching for any change, but none came. The system appeared to be functioning normally again. I closed the box, securing the latch. The incident was unsettling. The broken paint rings suggested deliberate tampering, yet the lack of relay clicks and thermal activity was baffling. I made a detailed entry in the logbook, noting the swapped pilot lights, the silent state change, and the evidence of recent access. I also included the infrared readings and the diagnostic results. I knew I would have to file a formal report with dispatch in the morning. This was beyond a simple electrical fault. It felt like something had been intentionally manipulated, but without any clear purpose or method. I drove back slowly, the fog thickening on the highway. My radio crackled with distant static, but no calls came through. The experience left a quiet dread. It was not the kind of mechanical failure I was used to. It was too precise, too deliberate, and too silent. The idea of someone working on that box in the deep night, making changes that defied logical explanation, stayed with me. I considered the possibility of a prank, but the remote location and the specific nature of the manipulation made it seem unlikely. The sheriff's department investigated my report a few days later. They found no footprints in the hardened mud around the box, no tire tracks on the gravel shoulder beyond my own. There was no evidence of forced entry, just the broken paint rings on the bolts. The case was eventually filed as an unexplained incident with a note about potential vandalism. I still think about that creek crossing. The silence of those relays, the cool metal and the swapped lights. It was a kind of quiet trespass. I sometimes wonder what else might have been done, or what might still be happening out there, in the dark. I was a millwright, assigned to the night shift at a remote coal tipple. The air was barely above freezing, a heavy fog clinging to the Holler bridges in the surrounding forest. Something felt off that night, a subtle shift in the usual industrial hum. My job involved routine maintenance and emergency repairs across the entire processing facility. This included the primary crusher, the conveyor systems, and the towering tipple structure itself. The tipple stood like a skeletal monument, its catwalks and chutes reaching high above the floodplain. It was a lonely post, especially after midnight, with only the distant static of the dispatch radio for company. The nearest town was about 3 miles away, a collection of old company houses and a single gas station. My shift started just after sundown, and I usually worked alone until the morning crew arrived. I knew every creak and groan of that structure, every shadow cast by my headlamp beam. The isolation was a constant companion, a quiet presence in the cold night air. The tipple was an old beast, constantly shedding coal dust. It coated everything, the steel girders, the grated catwalks, the emergency equipment. This dust was fine, almost like talcum powder, accumulating in drifts along the edges of walkways and on flat surfaces. It was a familiar sight, a part of the job. I carried a small broom and dustpan for the worst of it, especially near electrical panels. The air always carried a faint, gritty taste, and the constant hum of the ventilation system was a low thrum in my chest. I often wore a respirator, even for routine checks, just to keep the worst of it out of my lungs. The facility was mostly automated, but human eyes were still needed for inspection. On this particular night, I was performing a scheduled inspection of the upper conveyor system. This meant climbing a series of steel ladders and traversing narrow catwalks, about 5 stories above the ground. My headlamp cut a sharp beam through the pervasive fog that had seeped into the structure. The air was still, unusually so for a facility with so many moving parts. I could hear the distant rumble of the primary crusher, a low, rhythmic pulse. As I reached the highest catwalk, the one leading to the emergency shower station, I noticed something unusual. A section of the catwalk, usually covered in an even layer of coal dust, appeared disturbed. It was not a footprint, nor a drag mark from equipment. Instead, the dust had been displaced, as if something had moved through it. The pattern was distinct, a clear outline of a human form, but without any depth. It was like a negative impression, where the dust had been lifted rather than pressed down. The shape was roughly 6 feet tall, narrow, and seemed to be facing away from me, towards the far end of the catwalk. My headlamp beam illuminated the strange phenomenon, making the fine particles shimmer. I stopped, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy steel railing. The cold metal bit into my glove. I swept my headlamp beam back and forth, confirming what I saw. The outline was precise, almost too perfect. There were no approach marks leading to it, no scuffs or smears in the surrounding dust. It simply began, a defined shape, and then continued for about 10 feet. The air around me felt suddenly colder, a sharp contrast to the usual ambient warmth from the machinery. I took a slow breath, the filtered air tasting metallic. I moved forward cautiously, my boots crunching softly on the dust-covered grating. As I approached the disturbance, I could see the dust itself was still in motion. A very subtle, almost imperceptible swirling. It was as if the shape had just passed, and the particles were slowly settling back into place. The movement was not random. It followed the contours of the absent form. I reached the start of the shape, my headlamp beam fixed on the ground. There was no explanation for it. No open windows, no strong drafts. The ventilation system was running at its usual setting, creating a consistent, gentle airflow. The dust figure continued its path along the catwalk, maintaining its distinct, human-like outline. It moved with an eerie precision, the fine coal particles seeming to cling to an invisible surface. I followed it, my steps slow and deliberate. The only sound was the distant hum of the plant and the soft tick of cooling steel. My heart began to beat a little faster, a dull thud against my ribs. I pulled out my phone, switching on its video recorder. The low light from my headlamp made the dust shimmer even more on the screen. I filmed the entire length of the disturbance, narrating my observations in a low, steady voice. The dust figure stopped abruptly. Its endpoint was precisely at the emergency shower pull chain. The chain hung down, a bright yellow handle against the dark steel. The dust swirled around the base of the shower unit, then simply ceased. There were no exit marks beyond it, no continuation of the pattern. It was as if the form had dissolved or simply ceased to exist at that exact spot. I stood there for a long moment, my headlamp beam fixed on the shower pull. The silence on the catwalk felt heavy, broken only by my own breathing. I reached out, my gloved hand hovering over the disturbed dust. I did not touch it. I backed away slowly, keeping the phone camera rolling. I filmed the entire catwalk again, showing the undisturbed dust leading up to the shape, and the equally undisturbed dust beyond the shower station. The lack of footprints, the precise outline, the way the dust seemed to hold its form. It defied any logical explanation. I felt a cold whisper of unease brush against me. I completed my inspection of the conveyor system, but my focus was fractured. Every shadow seemed to hold a new, unsettling possibility. I descended the ladders, my grip tight on the cold rungs. Once I was back in the control cabin, I reviewed the video footage. The phone screen showed the same inexplicable phenomenon. The dust figure was clear, its outline stark against the dark grating. I saved the video and then called my supervisor. I kept my voice calm, factual, describing only what I had observed. He listened without interruption, then told me to file a detailed report in the logbook. He said he would review the security camera footage from the main gate, though he doubted anything would show up. The tipple itself had no internal cameras on the catwalks. I spent the rest of my shift in the cabin, the radio crackling occasionally with distant dispatch calls. The incident report I typed was purely observational. I noted the date, time, location, and the specific details of the dust disturbance. I attached the video file to the digital logbook entry. I also checked the material safety data sheet for coal dust, confirming its fine particulate nature and its tendency to settle quickly. There was nothing in the MSDS that could explain what I had witnessed. The supervisor arrived with the morning crew, his face tired. He watched the video on my phone, his expression unreadable. He walked the catwalk himself, but by then, the dust had settled completely, leaving no trace of the figure. The official report concluded with unexplained environmental disturbance. There was no evidence of trespass, no equipment malfunction, no unusual wind patterns. The file was closed. I continued to work the night shift, But the isolation felt different after that. Every shift, I would check that catwalk, my headlamp sweeping the dust for any sign. I never saw it again. The memory of the dust, swirling around an absent form, remained vivid. Sometimes, when the wind is still and the fog rolls in thick from the floodplain, I can almost feel the cold spot on that catwalk. I still hear the faint, almost imperceptible hiss of settling dust. I was a volunteer with the local search and rescue team. It was a cold, clear night in late autumn, well past midnight. The scanner traffic had been unusually quiet for hours. Our dispatch call came in just as a light frost began to settle on the windshield. A lone vehicle, a pickup truck, had been reported overdue from a remote section of the old coal country backroads. The driver was a local prospector, known for venturing into forgotten areas. His last known position was near the Tipples Ford, a low water crossing notorious for its unpredictable currents and shifting gravel bed. The ford was located deep within a network of unpaved trails, remnants of old logging and mining operations. These routes often led to abandoned company towns and overgrown clearings, places rarely visited. My partner, Mark, was already prepping the winch gear when I arrived at the station. We loaded the thermal monocular and the incident sheet, then headed out into the isolation of the night. Our routine for these calls was well established. We would navigate the winding, unlit roads, listening to the hum of the engine and the occasional static burst from the radio. The air grew colder as we left the highway, the headlights cutting through the deepening fog that clung to the low-lying areas. We passed several decaying Holler bridges, their wooden planks groaning under the weight of the truck. The terrain was rugged, marked by steep inclines and sharp descents, with dense forest pressing in on both sides. We knew the ford well. It was a common trouble spot, especially after any significant rain. The river, usually shallow, could swell rapidly, making the crossing treacherous. Our primary goal was always to locate the vehicle and assess the driver's condition, then secure the scene for recovery. This particular night, the river levels were low, which should have made the crossing straightforward. We reached the approach to the ford a little before 2 in the morning. The headlights illuminated the narrow trail, ending abruptly at the water's edge. The river here was wide, perhaps 100 feet across, with a visible sandbar in the middle. The water flowed shallow, barely covering the tires of our heavy-duty truck. There was no sign of the prospector's vehicle on either bank. Mark and I surveyed the scene. The thermal monocular showed no heat signatures on the immediate banks or the sandbar. The cold air carried the faint rush of the shallow water over the rocks. We decided to cross the ford to check the far bank, as the prospector might have made it across and then gotten stuck further down the trail. Mark engaged the winch, securing the cable to a sturdy oak on our side. The rope creaked under tension as we slowly began to pull the truck across. The water was indeed low, only reaching the bottom of the doors. The tires churned the gravel, creating a low, grinding sound. We were about halfway across, the truck moving steadily through the current, when I heard it. It was a small voice, clear despite the water noise and the winch's hum. The sound seemed to come from the sandbar, directly to our left. It was a child's voice, asking for a ride. I immediately looked towards the sandbar. Our headlights swept across its surface, It was empty. There was nothing there but wet sand and a few scattered river stones. I glanced at Mark. He had heard it too. His eyes were wide, fixed on the sandbar. We both stopped, the truck idling in the middle of the ford, the winch cable taut. The voice came again, a little louder this time, a soft, almost pleading tone. It repeated the request for a ride. The sound was distinct, unmistakably that of a young child. We scanned the sandbar again with the thermal monocular. The screen remained blank, showing only the ambient temperature of the wet sand and the cold air. No heat signature, no movement, no form. It was completely empty. The river current continued its quiet rush. The winch cable remained under tension. We sat in silence for a few moments, listening. The voice did not return. Mark slowly disengaged the winch, and we backed the truck carefully to our original bank. The experience was unsettling, a complete break from the procedural reality of our work. We had to investigate. We parked the truck and grabbed our gear. Mark took the thermal unit, and I carried a powerful spotlight. We walked to the edge of the ford, then waded into the cold water, making our way towards the sandbar. The water was barely above our ankles, the current gentle. The sandbar itself was flat and featureless, about 20 feet wide and perhaps 50 feet long. Our boots left clear impressions in the damp sand. We walked its entire length, sweeping the area with the spotlight and the thermal imager. There was absolutely nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, no sign that anyone, let alone a child, had ever been there. The sand was undisturbed except for our own tracks. The air remained still and cold. We returned to the truck, baffled. The incident sheet remained blank regarding this new development. We knew what we had heard, but there was no evidence to support it. We decided to proceed with the original mission, crossing the ford to check the far bank. This time, we kept the windows up, listening intently. The crossing was uneventful, the winch operating smoothly. We reached the far bank and drove a short distance up the trail. Still no sign of the prospector's truck. We turned around and headed back towards the ford. As we approached the water's edge on the far side, our headlights caught something on the bank. There were footprints in the soft, damp earth. They were small, consistent with a child's boot. The tracks led from the bank directly into the water, heading back towards the sandbar and our original side. There were no tracks leading out of the water onto the bank. It was as if someone had walked out of the forest, stepped into the river, and simply vanished. The tracks were fresh, clearly defined in the mud. We stopped the truck and got out again. Mark and I examined the tracks closely. They were distinct, showing the tread pattern of a small boot. They began at the edge of the tree line, followed a short path to the water, and then disappeared into the current. There were no other prints, no signs of a struggle, no indication of where the child might have come from or gone. We followed the tracks back into the forest for a short distance, but they quickly faded into the dense undergrowth and fallen leaves. The thermal monocular again showed nothing. The cold silence of the forest was absolute. We documented the tracks with photographs, noting their direction and the lack of any return path. We then radioed dispatch, reporting the unusual finding. The dispatcher, accustomed to strange occurrences in these remote areas, simply logged our observations without comment. We were instructed to continue our search for the prospector. We crossed the ford again, the water now feeling colder, the silence heavier. The sandbar remained empty. We continued our patrol for another few hours, eventually locating the prospector's truck stuck in a ditch about 3 miles further down the trail. He was unharmed, just out of cell service and unable to free his vehicle. We winched him out and he was able to drive away. We filed our incident report back at the station. The section on the child's voice and the one-sided footprints was brief and factual. It noted the sensory details, the lack of visual confirmation, and the absence of any heat signature. The photographs of the footprints were attached to the file. No missing persons report for a child had been filed in the area. Local law enforcement was notified, but without further evidence, there was little they could do. The event was logged as an unexplained occurrence. I still think about that night sometimes. The sound of that small voice, clear and distinct, asking for a ride from an empty sandbar. The image of those small boot tracks, leading only into the water, with no path back. The memory of the cold, the quiet, and the profound sense of isolation that settled over the ford.